The chandeliers were overcompensating that night. 1,200 crystals catching and fracturing the light until every glass of champagne looked like liquid gold. A string quartet was trying their best to sound expensive, and someone from marketing had decided we needed a photo wall that read, 10 years of fearless growth in gold foil. I stood by the edge of the crowd, holding a flute of something I couldn't taste, watching the leadership circle bask under a spotlight that didn't belong to them. The CEO, Miles Renner, was telling the same story he told every year, how he started the company in his garage, back when success still smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. The crowd laughed on cue. Half of them weren't even here back then. I was. I remembered that garage, the broken heater, the bad wiring, the nights I stayed until dawn drafting the risk models that would later convince investors we were stable enough to survive the storm. I built the compliance scaffolding they now used as a safety net. And yet tonight, my name was missing from the program. It should have been a sign. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" a voice said beside me. Mara Chen, HR director, wearing a black dress that tried too hard to blend in. She held an envelope in her left hand, cream, thick paper, embossed with the company crest. I smiled. For some of us. Her throat moved before she spoke. "Elena, I'm so sorry, but I need to deliver this now. It's effective immediately." She handed it to me as if it might burn her fingers. The orchestra was swelling, something celebratory and too loud. Around us, champagne flutes clinked. People cheered as Miles raised his glass. I didn't move. I just looked at that envelope, my name printed cleanly across it. "Effective immediately," she'd said. I opened it. The letter inside was short, 3 sentences of corporate mercy dressed in legalese. "Following a strategic realignment of leadership, your role as Chief Risk Officer is being dissolved. We thank you for your contributions to the company's success." No warning, no HR meeting, no notice period, just the paper equivalent of a bullet. Mara whispered something about timing, about wanting to handle this discreetly. Her voice trembled with the kind of guilt that knows it won't sleep well. I folded the letter neatly and slipped it back into the envelope. "Thank you, Mara. Enjoy the party." I walked past her toward the exit. Behind me, the CEO's toast echoed through the ballroom. "To everyone who made the last decade possible, and to the new chapter ahead." People cheered again. No one noticed me leaving. Outside, the winter air sliced through the silk of my dress. My heels clicked against the marble steps, a metronome to the end of an era. I stood beneath the grand awning of the Imperial Hotel and watched the snow begin to fall, soft, quiet, indifferent. My phone buzzed. A new email from HR. Subject line, termination confirmation. Timestamp, 2046. It took exactly 3 seconds for the irony to hit me. The Imperial was a corporate-sponsored event, booked, insured, and paid for by the company. I was technically still on duty, representing them, as the event fell within my executive participation clause. And there, at 8:46 p.m., they had documented the exact time of my dismissal, mid-event, during active company representation. Clause 9.4b. Termination during an official corporate-sponsored event shall constitute an immediate executive severance event, inclusive of all insurance-backed compensation, unless preceded by formal notice of separation. They'd just signed the check themselves. The snow deepened. I slipped the envelope into my clutch, hailed a cab, and smiled for the first time that night. Not because I was free, because they hadn't read the fine print. And that, I thought as the city lights blurred past the window, was their first and most expensive mistake. 2 days before the gala, the silence around me became instructional. Calendar invites that used to arrive with attachments came bare. A board prep deck moved to restricted, and I was the one who had written the restriction schema. My title still sat on the org chart, but my access looked like a house with the lights turned off, one room at a time. I made tea I wouldn't drink and opened the secure archive I keep for myself. Redundant copies, checksum logs, a habit born from too many careers ending on a Friday afternoon. In the folder labeled Employment Core, there it was. My agreement, 5 versions deep, and the rider no one remembered until it cost them the price of an expensive mistake. Clause 9.4b didn't always exist. I wrote it with a pen that skipped whenever I pressed too hard, 3 years and 1 merger ago, after HR streamlined 2 VPs out of the building during an investor luncheon. The optics alone should have been expensive. What made it worse was the timing. They had each been listed as executive hosts for the event. I watched the indemnity cascade hit the balance sheet like a slow-building wave. Late invoices, a threatened clawback, an angry carrier asking pointed questions about continuity representations. I learned more from that week than from any course I ever took. So when the acquisition came and the legal team opened my file to refresh terms, I asked for a short meeting. The new GC was precise and tired in the way only deal lawyers get. I slid my draft across the table. A rider titled Executive Participation and Event Termination Protection. Not flamboyant, surgical. 2 definitions did all the work. Corporate-sponsored event. Any function paid for or reimbursed by the company where executives are expected to attend or represent the company. Galas, roadshows, investor days, conferences, customer summits. Termination notice. Written advance notice, delivered at least 24 hours before such an event, acknowledging that the company intends to separate the executive and relieving the executive of representational duties. Then the engine. If employment is terminated while the executive is attending a corporate-sponsored event and no termination notice preceded the event by 24 hours, the separation shall constitute an executive severance event. And the teeth. Upon an executive severance event, the company shall immediately fund severance per Schedule A, and the Transaction Risk Policy Annex 2 and Retention Escrow Annex 3 shall be instructed to remit the executive event amount within 3 business days upon presentation of the time-stamped termination record. Schedule A was simple math. 2 years' salary, full bonus, equity acceleration, COBRA stipend, and a kicker tied to my continuity reps during the merger. It totaled $12 million and change because the carrier priced my risk as if I were a circuit breaker. Cheap until you touch it while the currents live. People think clauses like this are vanity. They aren't. They are logistics. During negotiations, I let the CFO believe it was about civility. We won't embarrass you in public. You won't surprise us in public. The part I pressed quietly was integration. The rider referenced actual systems, HRIS timestamps, the venue contract ID, the event participation schedule maintained by corporate affairs, and LegalNet, the document automation backbone that fires notices to the escrow agent. That was the nerve. Make compliance mechanical, not discretionary. We tested the plumbing months later, innocuously, not with a termination, but with a dummy role change at a customer summit, an event classified as corporate-sponsored. The alert chain worked. HRIS logged the event window. LegalNet mapped the time. The escrow trustee pinged back for confirmation. We built a kill switch to avoid false triggers, but the principle held. Time in, money out, if you're careless at the wrong moment. Back at my desk, the kettle had gone cold. I scrolled to the annexes. Annex 2. The transaction risk policy added during the merger. Think of it as reputation insurance with a legal spine. Annex 3. The retention escrow at Northfield Trust, seeded to keep key people from disappearing when the founders cashed out. Those annexes are where most stories go to sleep. People stop reading there. I don't. I reopened my writer and read it like I hadn't drafted every comma. The trigger conditions were not romantic. They were measurable. While attending. That meant the event had to be live and furnished. Without prior termination notice. That meant they had to warn me, in writing, the day before, and relieve me of representational duties. Time-stamped termination record. That meant their own system would witness against them. The email from corporate affairs about mandatory attendance for all executive officers sat in my inbox like a witness statement. My name was on the printed program, too. Small, near the end. Remarks, Chief Risk Officer. I wouldn't give those remarks, but the listing mattered. I forwarded Clause 9.4b and both annexes to my personal counsel with a subject line that read like a grocery list. Confirm integration still live? Her reply came minutes later. Yes, no sunset. Northfield is on file. Carrier unchanged since acquisition. You're covered. I thought about deleting the gala RSVP. Then I pictured the chandeliers and the CEO's annual garage story polished until it squeaked. I RSVP'd yes. That night, I printed 2 copies of the rider on heavy paper and sealed them in an envelope labeled, "For the Forgetful." It wasn't superstition. It was preparation. I placed one in my desk drawer at home, one in my bag. I set a reminder for 30 minutes before the gala. Check calendar, check email headers, check battery. Smile. When you work in risk long enough, you stop believing in luck and start believing in definitions. The weather report doesn't make the storm come. It only makes you carry an umbrella. I packed mine, paper, precise, enforceable. In the morning, the CEO's assistant sent a cheerful blast about celebrating our decade together. I read it once, then again, slower. The footer listed the event as company-hosted and on the record. A line meant for PR alignment, but to me, it was a hinge the whole door now swung on. By the time the car dropped me at the Imperial, the rest of the plan was already written by their own policies. House lights, open bar, cameras, name badges, the polite fiction of unity. All they had to do was remember to be careful. All I had to do was let them forget. The ballroom glowed like an overproduced apology. I arrived early, not because I wanted to, but because optics mattered, and optics were about to do most of my work for me. The company had spared no indulgence. Polished marble floors reflected the swirl of champagne and ambition. Branded banners stretched across the mezzanine, proclaiming a decade of fearless growth. I smiled at the phrase. Fearless, yes, but not careful. Miles, our CEO, loved spectacle. He believed success was best demonstrated under chandeliers and hashtags. It shows we're human, he'd once said, arranging for an influencer to film him hugging interns during orientation week. Now, he was the human embodiment of a tax deduction, perfectly tanned, slightly drunk, and surrounded by people who'd trade ethics for a photo op. Mara from HR hovered nearby, the envelope still unopened in her clutch. Her eyes avoided mine, the way people look away from a road accident they helped cause. I nodded politely, then drifted toward the bar. Whiskey, neat, I said. The bartender poured without a word. I appreciated that, the quiet efficiency of someone who understood contracts without needing to read them. I checked my phone. 8:43 p.m. My email inbox was still empty. At 8:46, it wouldn't be. The company photographer was making rounds, capturing laughter and alliances. He caught me in one frame. I could tell by the flash. It was a strange, fitting moment to be recorded. the final photograph of me as their chief risk officer. Then Miles took the stage. 10 years ago, he began, I had nothing but a vision, a rented garage, and a handful of people who believed in the impossible. The crowd erupted. I lifted my glass but didn't drink. He continued, listing milestones like prayers. Funding rounds, acquisitions, partnerships, the new office tower downtown. He was reciting my work as if it had been conjured from thin air. And tonight, he said, his voice swelling, we celebrate not just our past, but our evolution. Because growth means change. And sometimes, change means new leadership. The room hushed. My spine straightened, but my face didn't move. Miles smiled, performing sincerity. Effective immediately, he continued, we'll be welcoming new leadership in risk and compliance as we expand our global footprint. Let's thank Elena Voss for her extraordinary service and dedication over the years. Applause. It was scattered at first, then gathered like an obedient tide. Glasses clinked. People smiled awkwardly in my direction, unsure whether to clap harder or stop entirely. I nodded once. It was the nod of someone who understood every clause in the building and the precise cost of this moment. Behind me, my phone buzzed. The vibration was small, almost polite. Subject: Termination confirmation. Timestamp: 2046. Sender: HRIS Auto Notify. The orchestra swelled again. Perfect timing. I looked down at the illuminated screen and felt a slow, clean calm spread through my chest. The system had recorded everything. The sender, the time, the location tag from the Imperial Hotel's corporate network. It was all the evidence I'd ever need. Mara's voice cracked beside me.
Elena, I didn't know they'd announce it like this. I smiled gently. They usually don't. I slipped my phone into my clutch. My glass caught the light, refracting a shard of gold across the tablecloth. Do enjoy the rest of your evening, Mara. I walked out slowly. You never rush in moments like that. Haste is for guilt. My heels clicked against the marble, echoing through applause that was already fading into another speech. Outside, the cold hit me like an honest sentence. A young valet approached with my coat. "Rough night?" he asked, trying for small talk. "Not at all," I said, pulling on my gloves. "Just very educational." He laughed, uncertain. I handed him a tip, climbed into the waiting car, and checked my phone again. HR's system had already filed a copy to LegalNet. The timestamp was immutable. My attendance record still showed active representation until 2200. 2 overlapping truths. They'd fired me at the event, and the event was still in progress. The car pulled away from the curb. Behind me, the Imperial glimmered like a mausoleum built for hubris. Through the tinted glass, I watched the lights blur into watercolor streaks. A text from my attorney appeared. "Saw the feed. You okay?" I replied, "Better than they are." Then I turned off my phone. The world outside had gone quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a detonation you can't yet hear. Inside my clutch, the termination letter lay folded, like a certificate. Not of loss, but proof. A record of when arrogance mistimed its performance. They thought they'd written my ending, but all they'd done was timestamp the beginning of theirs. The morning after the gala,
The city was still half asleep, hungover on champagne and bad decisions. My phone buzzed with the usual flood of "sorry again" messages. Colleagues who'd smiled through my firing now performing digital remorse. I ignored them. Remorse isn't a currency I trade in.
Instead, I brewed coffee the way I always did when something irreversible had begun. Slow, measured, methodical. The scent filled the kitchen, rich and grounding. My apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the radiator and the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. I've learned that silence, properly used, is the sharpest weapon in corporate war. By 7 a.m., I had 3 windows open on my laptop. My employment contract, last amended 3 years ago. The LegalNet confirmation email with the timestamp, 2046 Imperial Hotel Wi-Fi. My private correspondence folder, labeled Continuity Documentation. Every line in those files was a nerve ending in a sleeping giant. All I had to do was press the right one. I opened the contract and read Clause 9.4b aloud, softly, as though speaking to the ghosts of the boardroom that signed it. If employment is terminated while the executive is attending a corporate-sponsored event without prior termination notice, such termination shall constitute an executive severance event. Then, upon an executive severance event, the company shall immediately fund severance per Schedule A and direct its transaction carrier and escrow agent to remit the executive event amount. $12,084,000. They'd called it symbolic compensation during negotiation. I'd called it precise. At 7:12, I forwarded the HR email to my attorney with a single sentence. Subject, triggered. Body, event termination, timestamp attached, confirm activation process. Her reply came 5 minutes later. Confirmed. Escrow notice will auto-initiate once the carrier's algorithm registers HRIS sync. ETA 48 to 72 hours. I'll alert counsel for the trust. Do not contact the company. They'll contact you. I smiled. The beauty of automation. No screaming, no scandal, just code and consequence. The rest of the morning unfolded like choreography. I printed everything. Timestamped email, termination letter, gala attendance memo, event sponsorship invoice. I built a single, perfect evidence folder labeled 9.4b Confirmation, VOS. Each document was a brick in the wall they didn't know they'd built around themselves. By noon, finance had already begun to stir. My friend in Treasury, not a friend exactly, but someone who understood quiet reciprocity, sent a message from her personal account. They're panicking. CFO just asked IT to verify if the gala counts as official representation. You might want to stay invisible today. Invisible was exactly the plan. At 2, my attorney called. Her tone was amused. They're already reaching out to the carrier trying to freeze the payout. Unfortunately for them, the system doesn't care about their panic. The escrow trigger is governed by policy, not permission. They'll argue the gala wasn't a work event, I said. Already tried. The sponsorship contract lists it under Executive Participation Event. Their own PR department issued a press release with your name and title as host. I'd frame it. I did. I printed that press release and slid it into the folder. Beneath it, I added the internal memo from Corporate Affairs inviting all officers to attend. Attendance mandatory. The line was almost poetic now. Later that evening, I sat by the window, watching the snow gather in slow, deliberate layers, the city softening under white. It mirrored the calm that had replaced any trace of anger. My version of revenge wasn't loud. It was procedural. Precise.
Around 8 p.m., I received the first call from Miles. I let it ring out. He left a voicemail that began with miscommunication and ended with, "Let's talk this through." I didn't reply. The contract would do the talking. At 10:14, a message from HR appeared. Urgent. Clarification request. I opened it long enough to read the first line. We'd like to confirm your understanding of the termination timing and context. I closed it. Every word they sent now was a nail sealing their own case. Before bed, I checked LegalNet one more time. The status beside my name had changed. Executive Severance event active. Carrier, Lloyd Bridge Transaction Assurance. Beneficiary, E. Voss. It was done. The digital equivalent of a pen stroke on stone. I shut the laptop, leaned back, and exhaled. There was no satisfaction yet, just inevitability unfolding. They would call, they would panic, they would spin. And through it all, the system would keep processing, line by line, code by code, indifferent to regret. I stood by the window again, the city below glowing with restless light. Somewhere in the financial district, the servers were already calculating interest on a $12,084,000 lesson in fine print. The silence in my apartment deepened. The kind that comes right before a storm reaches the boardroom. And for the first time in years, I slept without setting an alarm. Lloyd Bridge confirmed the event, the timestamp validated through both HRIS and Wi-Fi verification. Escrow release pending. They'll try to block it. They can't, she said. It's automatic. The only way to stop it now is to claim fraud, which would require them admitting they fired you at a corporate-sponsored event on the record. A pause, then her voice softened. Congratulations, Elena. You just taught a masterclass in preventive law. I didn't celebrate. I made tea, opened my laptop, and began watching the inevitable unfold in real time. By noon, the company's internal memo leaked. Someone in legal, probably one of the paralegals who'd once asked me to review her non-disclosure, had quietly forwarded it to a journalist at the Ledger. The headlines spread fast. Termination during gala triggers $12 million payout. Compliance officer outsmarts own company. I wasn't surprised. Scandal has a half-life measured in hours, not days. Within 3 hours, #Gala Clause trended on LinkedIn. At 12:47, Miles called again. This time I answered. Elena, he started, voice stretched thin. We need to resolve this internally. The board is... I'm sure they are, I said, calm as still water. But the process is already in motion. You know that. We can offer you something better if you'll retract the claim. This clause, it's outdated. It wasn't meant to... Be enforced? I asked. He hesitated. It's just... 12 million, Elena. You're reasonable. You know how this looks. I let him speak into the quiet. Then I said, Miles, the clause isn't about optics. It's about discipline. You of all people should understand that. He exhaled hard, a sound like paper tearing. We never meant for it to happen this way. That, I said, is precisely why it did. I ended the call. At 2:10 p.m., the first legal notice arrived, a formal acknowledgement from Lloyd Bridge. Funds in transit to Northfield escrow account, beneficiary E. Voss. Attached was a digital confirmation, date, time, transaction hash. Irrevocable. By 3, HR's internal Slack messages leaked too. I read them with detached fascination. Mara HR. Did anyone check her old contract before Miles announced it? Legal Jared. We thought it was rolled over after the merger. Mara HR. It wasn't. Legal Jared. Jesus Christ. They had forgotten what I never did, that legacy clauses are like mines left in soil. They don't disappear. They just wait for weight. My phone vibrated again, this time with a message from a number I didn't recognize. This is James Holloway, counsel for Trivanta Holdings. I believe we should discuss a mutually beneficial resolution. I forwarded it to my lawyer. Her response? Do not engage. They're already boxed in.
By evening, the CFO released a statement to investors calling the situation an administrative misunderstanding. But the numbers told a different story. In compliance filings due that week, the payout had to be disclosed as a liability. $12 million, marked as executive severance expense, unbudgeted. It shaved 3 points off their quarterly projections before midnight. At 8:46 p.m., exactly 48 hours after the firing, the notification appeared in my inbox. Subject: escrow disbursement confirmation. Amount: $12,084,000 US. Status: cleared. For a moment, I just stared at it. The number glowed against the white background like quiet proof that precision, not emotion, wins wars. I poured a glass of wine, the good one I'd been saving, and stood by the window as the city pulsed below. Somewhere downtown they were in crisis meetings drafting apologies they'd never send me. On the counter, my phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. You could have warned us. I typed back, I did. 3 years ago. You called it paranoia. I didn't send it. I deleted the message instead. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick, heavy flakes drifting over the skyline. I thought about all the times I'd been called rigid, meticulous, too cautious. How men like Miles mocked the language of contracts until those same words turned into iron. By midnight, my name was trending alongside the company's. They'd tried to bury me under a press release. Instead, they'd exhumed every line I ever wrote. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a timestamp. 2046, glowing quietly in a database, doing exactly what it was designed to do. And for the first time since that night under the chandeliers, I allowed myself to laugh. Soft, brief, certain. They'd raised a glass to fearless growth. I'd raised one to accountability. And only one of us walked away with the check. By Tuesday morning, the company was on fire, politely, legally, and very publicly. I didn't need insider updates anymore. The news cycle had picked up the scent and was gnawing through it like wolves. The Ledger, Forbes, and half a dozen industry blogs ran the story under different headlines, but the message was the same. Risk officer fired mid-gala, company forgets clause, pays $12 million. The comment sections were brutal. Former employees came crawling out of the archives, sharing anonymous confessions about toxic leadership and systemic negligence. Investors called it a governance failure. HR called it a miscommunication. Legal called it contained. But containment doesn't exist once the internet smells irony. By noon, a photo from the gala surfaced, me standing by the bar, glass in hand, expression unreadable while the CEO raised his toast behind me. Someone captioned it, "The face of someone who already knows the ending." They weren't wrong. My attorney had warned me to keep quiet. "Let them spiral," she said. "The more noise they make, the more authenticated your evidence becomes." So I did what I do best. Documented. Quietly, methodically.
Every leak that appeared online had a digital breadcrumb pointing back to their own systems. Internal Slack exports, time-stamped invites, memos. Even the seating chart for the gala listed me as Executive Representative Risk Division. It was all admissible. All public now. Meanwhile, inside the company, the unraveling turned into an art form. I still had friends in operations, and corporate gossip flows faster than quarterly reports. Ops Jenna. Miles just canceled his flight to Zurich. Ops Jenna. CFO resigned this morning. Said something about fiduciary liability exposure. Ops Jenna. Mara's on leave. They're auditing HR policies. Guess why? By evening, the board issued a press release that read like an obituary for competence. The company is reviewing internal practices related to executive terminations and event protocol to ensure alignment with best governance standards. Translation: we set ourselves on fire and are now reading the manual on fire extinguishers. The irony didn't escape the markets. The company's stock fell 8% by Wednesday. Analysts cited reputational risk following compliance oversight. Shareholders called emergency meetings. The irony of firing a risk officer for optics, then losing millions over optics, was too poetic even for me. At 4 p.m., a private email came from Miles himself. No assistants, no CCs, just him. Elena, you've made your point. I'd like to meet privately to discuss a resolution that benefits both of us. The press is distorting the truth. We can fix this if you're willing to move on quietly. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to my lawyer with the note, predictable. She called within the hour, laughing softly. They still think this is negotiable. It's not, I said. The system already did the negotiation for us. What I didn't tell her was that Miles's email wasn't angering me. It was confirming everything I'd ever suspected about power in our world. They confuse silence for weakness, procedure for submission. They forget that compliance isn't obedience, it's control with documentation. By Thursday, the audit committee got involved. That's when the real bloodletting began. They discovered that HR's firing protocol had been verbally approved without legal review. The timestamp I'd received wasn't a fluke, it was evidence of procedural breach. Every part of it, time, place, wording, violated the executive conduct policy they themselves had built. And the most beautiful part? The insurance carrier Lloyd Bridge issued a statement confirming that my payout wasn't discretionary, it was mandated by contract. Public, final, irrevocable. The board's panic became visible. 2 directors resigned within hours of the disclosure. A third posted a vague note on LinkedIn about learning humility through crisis. The comments were merciless. I didn't say a word publicly. I didn't need to. My silence had become the story. That night I opened a bottle of wine and scrolled through the chaos with the calm of someone who had already outlasted it. The reporters kept requesting interviews. I ignored them. Truth doesn't need a microphone when documentation already speaks fluent mathematics. A final message came through at midnight from Mara, the HR director. Elena, I never wanted it to happen that way. I warned them about the clause, but they laughed. I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I've resigned too. I stared at her words for a long moment. Then I replied with the only thing that felt true. You were right to warn them. They just didn't understand the cost of forgetting fine print. After that, I turned off every notification and looked out across the city. The skyline shimmered with light, each office tower still buzzing with people who thought control came from titles, not terms. I'd built systems to prevent collapse. Ironically, it was collapse that proved they worked.
In less than a week, the company had gone from celebration to crisis, from toasts to tribunals. The $12 million wasn't punishment, it was tuition. They called me cold, procedural, detached. Maybe they were right. But I've seen what chaos costs when emotion leads and documentation lags. By Friday morning, the CEO's resignation letter hit the press. A single paragraph that began with, "In light of recent events," and ended with, "effective immediately." I read it once. Then I smiled, softly, not out of malice, but recognition. The board had finally learned the lesson I'd spent a decade teaching. If you build a system without understanding it, the system will eventually understand you.
By the time Friday's sunrise hit the mirrored glass of Trivanta's tower, the company was already split in two. The version that existed before the gala, and the one now dissected on every financial network. I watched it unfold from my kitchen, the news ticker beneath a panel of analysts debating whether I was strategically brilliant or vindictive. Neither, I thought. Just prepared. At 9:03 a.m., a notification flashed across my phone. Breaking. CEO Miles Renner resigns following $12 million contract scandal. The segment featured clips of the gala video. The moment of my firing replayed in slow motion like a courtroom exhibit. The reporter's voice dripped irony. The decision to terminate Ms. Voss mid-event appears to have activated a clause that cost the company millions. Every word of it was true. Every dollar earned. I sat on the couch, laptop open, while the world digested what Trivanta had tried to hide. Their press release called it a regrettable misunderstanding. The shareholders called it a breach of fiduciary duty. The Department of Labor called it interesting. My lawyer, Vivian, called me. "Congratulations," she said dryly. "You're the new case study in executive law programs across 3 universities. They've named it the Gala Clause." "Poetic," I said. "They'll probably ask you to lecture someday." "I prefer silence to applause," I replied, and she laughed softly. The tired, knowing laugh of someone who'd seen too much of both. By noon, the company's internal communications leaked again. Board minutes, audit transcripts. Someone had posted them anonymously, and the internet devoured every word. The documents detailed how the leadership team had dismissed my warnings about governance for years. One line stood out like prophecy. "Voss tends to over-engineer compliance protections. She worries too much about hypotheticals." That sentence alone probably wiped $2 million off their valuation. At 2 p.m., I received an unexpected call. Not from the media, not from investors, but from the acting chair of the board. Her voice was calm, resigned. "Elena, this is Meredith Cole. I'm stepping in as interim CEO. I wanted to reach out personally." "That's brave," I said. She exhaled, slow. "You've been vindicated. The clause was valid, the payout justified. I can't undo what they did, but I wanted to thank you for documenting it as cleanly as you did. You spared us years of litigation." "I didn't do it for you, Meredith. I know." Her honesty surprised me. She paused before adding, "The board is offering to release a statement publicly acknowledging fault. No NDA, no clawback. It's the least we can do." For a long moment, I said nothing. The city buzzed beyond the window. Taxis, construction, people late for lives that wouldn't make headlines. Finally, I said, "Then do it. Transparency costs less than silence." That night, the official statement went live. Following an internal review, Trivanta Holdings acknowledges the procedural and ethical failures surrounding the termination of its former Chief Risk Officer, Ms. Elena Voss. The board accepts full responsibility for the activation of the executive severance clause and commends Ms. Voss for her professionalism throughout. I didn't need their commendation, but I understood the weight of it. In corporate language, commendation means surrender. Within hours, my inbox flooded. Recruiters, journalists, former colleagues who suddenly remembered how much they always admired my integrity. I ignored them all. Some apologies are just rebranding exercises. At midnight, my attorney called one last time. "It's done," she said. "Funds cleared, no disputes pending. You're officially free." Free. The word felt unfamiliar. For a decade, I'd built walls of policy and procedure, only to realize they were also keeping me in. I opened the window, letting the cold air sweep through the apartment. The city hummed below. The sound of a machine that never learns, only resets. Somewhere out there, another board was drafting another clause they'd never bothered to read. My phone buzzed again, a text from a number I hadn't seen in years. It was Darla, one of the analysts I'd mentored back when the company still felt human. "They're calling you the quiet architect. I just wanted to say thank you for proving that ethics still win, even if they whisper." I read it twice, then locked the phone and watched the skyline. The lights from Trivanta's tower glimmered in the distance, but the top floors were dark now. Miles's office. In the end, no one had destroyed him. Not me, not the board, not the press. The contract had. His own signature, the same flourish he used to perform for photographers, was the instrument of his undoing. It was never revenge. It was symmetry. Before bed, I took the printed copy of the clause from my desk, the one I'd kept since the merger, and placed it in a fireproof envelope. On it, I wrote in pen, "Precision is the purest form of power." Then I sealed it. Trivanta would recover someday. Companies always do. They would rebrand, replace logos, release apologies. The world would move on. But for now, the silence was mine. Earned, clean, and final. Tomorrow I'd decide what came next. Tonight, justice had already closed the file. 2 months later, winter loosened its grip on the city. The snow that once covered everything, the same night it fell outside the Imperial Hotel, had melted into glassy puddles reflecting the next season's light. The world had moved on. I had not rushed to follow it. The payout had cleared, invested, and stabilized long ago. Vivian handled the trusts, the tax shelters, the polite letters from financial institutions suddenly discovering I existed. I didn't buy anything extravagant. No cars, no houses, no headlines. Money wasn't the point. It was proof. Proof that discipline outlives charm. I rented a small place by the sea instead, a quiet strip of coast an hour north where the water spoke in low tones, and no one knew my name. My days followed a rhythm. Morning walks, coffee brewed slow, emails from lawyers tapering into silence. The peace felt earned, not luxurious, but precise, like a well-drafted clause. From time to time, my phone would light up with remnants of the old world. Trivanta's new leadership was deep in restructuring. Their quarterly report listed non-recurring executive losses as a footnote, a sterile phrase for what had really happened, arrogance with an invoice. I didn't feel joy when I read it. I felt completion. One evening, an email arrived from a university dean. Law faculty, compliance division. They wanted to build a case study based on the Gala Clause, as they called it now. "Your consent would be appreciated," it read,
but the record stands regardless. I consented, quietly. Not for recognition, but for preservation. Somewhere, a student would read my name and learn that elegance and foresight can dismantle entire empires without a single raised voice. That was enough. I kept a copy of the contract in a safe, not for legal reasons, but sentimental ones. The paper was aged, the signature slightly faded, but the ink still carried weight. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the night under chandeliers, the applause, the glass raised mid-toast. The moment humiliation transformed into arithmetic. Mara wrote once. She was rebuilding herself at another company, this time as head of ethics and policy. Her email ended with, "You changed how I read every line, Elena. You made me afraid of commas, and grateful for them." I smiled at that. In our world, fear of commas was wisdom. Occasionally, I'd see Miles on business headlines, not in leadership, but commentary panels. He'd trimmed his hair, softened his tone, spoke about learning accountability the hard way. I didn't hold anger toward him anymore. He was just another man who mistook performance for permanence. The system had taught him better than I ever could. People still debated my motives. Some called me vindictive, others visionary. Both were wrong. I'd only done what I was trained to do, mitigate risk, even if the risk was my own erasure. The irony was that my job had never ended. It had simply changed direction. One morning in late March, I walked along the pier with coffee in hand. The sea was restless, shifting shades between blue and gray, like a contract between sky and water that hadn't been fully negotiated. I watched the horizon and thought about legacy, not as reputation but as structure, the systems we build, the clauses we leave behind, the unseen architecture that holds truth steady after noise fades. In a world addicted to performance, precision is rebellion. As the wind picked up, I took out my phone and opened the last file in my archive, Clause 9.4b, the one that ended an empire. I read it once more, the words still elegant, still unflinching. Then I deleted it. Not out of spite, but closure. The contract had served its purpose. It didn't need to live forever. When I got home, I placed my final printed copy in a sealed envelope marked Personal History, closed. I slid it into a drawer beside a single sentence I'd written on a scrap of stationery weeks ago. They called it the Gala Clause. I called it Remembering My Worth. Outside, the waves struck the rocks in measured rhythm, like a metronome counting down to calm. I sat by the window, tracing the rim of my cup, and smiled, small, deliberate, complete. No anger, no triumph, just stillness. Justice, when written correctly, doesn't echo, it endures. And somewhere, deep in the servers of a company that once thought itself untouchable, a timestamp still glowed quietly at 2046, a permanent reminder that even the finest celebrations can end with a clause.